There we go. So today, the purpose of it is really to give you a high-level overview and a snapshot of each of the projects that are the main contributing research outputs to this theme. So we've got a program of half a dozen presentations, and I'll give some conclusions and highlights at the end. We've only got 15 minutes for each researcher, so it's a real pressure on them to get their story fairly succinct, but they do have their final reports available very soon, if not already, and they're also, many of them are giving specific presentations for their projects. So I'm going to try and encourage researchers to allow some time for questions at the end, so I'll encourage you all to I'll let you know when you're 10 minutes into your 15-minute allocation, and then for everybody else, if you could just stay on mute unless you're presenting or if it's during question time. And as Holton said, please submit comments or questions using the chat function, and then I'll turn to him and Holton can address those with us. So just a very quick overview of the Tropical Water Quality Hub. It's been running since 2015, and I can say with confidence that it has conducted science that has led to more implementation of a range of on-ground works and reef repair outcomes. It's informed decision making, and hopefully those decisions inform the outcomes for the Great Barrier Reef. It's mostly Great Barrier Reef focused, and its catchment. It extends up to Torres Strait and the Coral Sea, but especially this theme is very much based in the catchment. The topical scope, it's mostly about water quality, but as we know, water quality has a lot of factors that influence it and actions that we need to understand to implement management changes. So it's fairly broad in its scope, and I can also say that the projects have been very highly applied. So especially here today, you'll hear about projects that have been undertaken by researchers in conjunction with landholders, but also with policy teams. A lot of workshops have been run to design or experiment with some of the new instruments. So we'll hear a little bit about that today. So the synthesis projects, this is for the final year of the hub. There's 8 altogether. There's one around innovation in COTS control, one really about restoring ecosystems from catchment to reef. So that includes reef restoration actions within the park and those systems, but also in the catchment, so wetlands and gully type stories. This one is about overcoming barriers to reducing nitrogen losses to the Great Barrier Reef. So as I said, very much looking at catchment actions to manage nitrogen. We talked yesterday about reducing end of catchment fine sediments in a very much a sea to source story. There's a topic around coral condition to inform resilience-based management. So that's really our Great Barrier Reef topic, looking at all the research that's been done around understanding how to better manage reef ecosystems and the current threats. And then there's one final one, which is looking at behaviour change and trust framework. So more the social side, I guess, of some of the sediment and nutrient stories to some extent. The last two that are a sort of higher level. So one's around the impact of the whole hub, and the last one is really about impact of the whole NESP program, of which we are contributing to. So they've sort of commenced at the beginning of this year. They're running in parallel with the final compilation of people's research and reports, which makes it a little bit challenging, but it has been, I think it will be a set of really useful outcomes to pull the whole investment together. So just a little bit of background to this theme. So, and why did NESP look at nutrient related investment in the first place? So as we know, water quality from land-based runoff is one of the major threats to the Great Barrier Reef, alongside things like climate change. But water quality has a really important role in managing impacts like climate change. During those periods of disturbance, if we can minimise other stresses such as water quality, then that's one of our greatest management options. And water quality is something that we do have to some degree control and management options for. So We normally talk about nutrients more broadly, but in that we really mean dissolved in organic nitrogen and particulate nutrients as well, and which were probably more specific with particulate nitrogen, all of which pose a risk to Great Barrier Reef, coastal and marine ecosystems. So greater inputs of those into the marine system can cause lower coral diversity. They're linked to the initiation and sustenance of crown thorn starfish outbreaks. They can lead to algal blooms, which in turn leads to reduced light. And then also the links that we're starting to understand better now about the increased susceptibility to other factors such as bleaching. So if you've got nutrients in the water, then the response of corals and other systems to higher temperatures can be more significant. The other important factor, and that's why we focus on dissolved in organic nitrogen, is it's available to the system immediately. So it can be taken up rapidly once it gets into those systems. So we're talking about 12,000 kilotons per year of DIN delivered to the DBR in our modelling estimates. That's about twice, increased twofold for the entire DBR catchment, but that ranges between the regions. So up to sixfold in some areas, and then it's much lower for somewhere like Cape York. Sugarcane is the dominant land use contributing to those DIN loads, and largely they're from the wet tropics catchments and also the lower Burdekin and then most other sugarcane areas. It also important contribution from other land uses such as urban, but in the scheme of things, I guess it's a relatively minor contributor, but when you're talking about local catchment or even smaller scale, then it can become important. Particulate nutrients, so I don't want to ignore them because they're also important. We're starting to understand more about their factors and influence on ecosystems, and they can be sourced from other land uses such as subsurface erosion attached to sediments. And we're understanding more, some of you would have joined yesterday to understand that they actually are being transformed quite early in flood plumes and become bioavailable as well. So in all that, we've got a number of policies that we work with. Unfortunately, we have had relatively slow progress towards the Reef Water Quality Improvement Plan targets for nutrient-related factors. This is, I guess, well captured in the last scientific consensus statement, but it was then highlighted and then much earlier than that as well, that we haven't got enough funding to fund everything everywhere. So management options obviously need to be cost effective and targeted. So we need to continually improve our understanding of where the material is coming from, how we can manage it better, and what does it mean for the marine system. So that's where NESP sort of has stepped in, looking at the catchment side of things and focusing on what are the management solutions for reducing nitrogen losses to the Great Barrier Reef. In terms of what nutrient-related research has been conducted through NESP over the last 5 years, there's this is really what we're hearing about today. So it's looking at new fertilizer technology, looking at the combination of, I guess, the urea-type fertilizers with the enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and assess the effect of using those on sugarcane production and also nitrogen losses, so water quality outcomes. Looked at integrated decision support tools, so to allow scheduling and automation of irrigation practices. That was in a trial in the lower Burdekin. Explored cost-effective options for land use transition in marginal cane areas to reduce nitrogen losses. So we'll hear about from Nathan about that. We've established a monitoring framework for design implementation of finer scale monitoring. This is obviously really important, has been growing interest with landholders, and it's also very useful in identifying pollutant generation hotspots in sugarcane areas. So combined with farmer engagement and social research, that's been used to establish, I guess, different mechanisms facilitating management change. Jim and others have explored the application of tradable permit schemes for nitrogen, which is more at the property scale, and then trading water quality credits, which works with a end of catchment sort of nutrient cap in the light of future expansion. And Peter and his team have looked at developing a prototype insurance product for ensuring the risk to cane yield as a result from reduced nitrogen rates. Finally, some of the work that John did in the earlier days looked at the cost effectiveness of nitrogen reduction in different projects and programs previously, and that's been an element that's been contained in a few of the projects. In our final year now, as I mentioned, is the synthesis output. So we've got for every theme a technical synthesis report, which is trying to provide a fairly succinct summary of the key findings of this collection of work. We're developing an interactive website, so Kate Hodge from Hodge Environmental is doing that based on a series of interactive conceptual diagrams, and then takes you off to different levels of information and access to resources, and then a number of case studies, or I guess combined products across the project. So for this theme, there's one around the important learnings about finer scale monitoring and assessment. So Aaron, Mike and Tony are looking at that one and looking at how that has, the learnings from that have become really important for understanding options for management at a finer scale, but also what does that mean when working with landholders. It probably focuses too more on the technical side of things. So if you are looking to establish the finer scale monitoring approaches, there'll be some guidance there. The alternative mechanisms theme is, or case study is, looking at the work that Jim, Peter, John, Yvette and Nathan are all progressing into one conceptual framework to illustrate the key findings of different, and the trial of different policy mechanisms, so for managing nitrogen losses. And then Mike and Yvette are doing a little summary, I guess, highlighting some of the outcomes of the work, looking specifically at advances in management practices. So with those, we are in the process of generating the content for them, and then they'll be developed in a series of products, but they will be using the interactive website as the basis for them. The final one that I am working on is not so much NESP work, although it draws on it, and it's just looking at the importance of reducing nitrogen from the marine perspective. And our current understanding of risk and extent of influence on marine ecosystem using a series of maps and website text, and that was partly triggered by the discussions at the Lieutenant inquiry. So before we move into the presentations, I'll just spend a minute on this diagram. So, and this links to our discussions that we've been having in one of the case studies, but I think it provides a neat framework for seeing how we can look across the work that's been done in NESP. So the top line is really about what are the main stages that need to be undertaken to, I guess, implement change. The next line is the issues associated with each of those, and then I've identified the NESP research or projects relevant into each of those clusters. So in terms of identifying actions, it's really about those on-farm practices, but also landscape changes, so things like offsets and land retirement if they become relevant. In that, we've got the Mike's work on EEFs, the irrigation technology, and I've missed off there Nathan's work in the land retirement or land transition type ideas. Understanding participation is also covered in another theme, as I mentioned, but it's really about understanding barriers to adoption, and that's probably where Aaron's work picks up in Project 25 around building knowledge and trust. And then designing instruments, so that's where there's a whole raft of options, one of which is things like market-based instruments, and that's where Jim and Peter have really focused their efforts in looking at trading, permits, reef credits, and then insurance programs. And then finally, the evaluation of options. So given all of that, what are our best management options? And cost effectiveness is a really important part of that, as well as effects on participation, whether you choose a mix of public and private benefits in terms of the outcomes, and then the mix of tools or instruments, I suppose. So that's where John's work fits in terms of the relevance of the cost effective assessments and what are the best options for us going forward to meet the targets. So I've gone over a little bit in time, but we'll just now start with the research highlights. So Mike's we're going to hear more about the management practices side of things first from Micah, Vet and Nathan before we go into the small scale monitoring work that Aaron's done, and then we'll have a 15-minute break, so we should have some time for questions there. So I will stop sharing my screen if I can figure that out.
Thanks. Okay, before I start, I'll just acknowledge the large team that's contributed to this project. As you can see, there's a cast of thousands on the slide there, but basically people in UQ, in SRA, in CSIRO, DNRME, if I've got the latest acronym right, and pharmacists in Mackay and the Burdekin. And I'd also like to acknowledge the late Phil Moody, who was a major instigator in this work in the beginning. Okay, the research focus for these studies was looking at the impact of adopting one or both of two strategies to reduce fertiliser end inputs, maintain productivity and reduce offsite losses. So we were looking for a win-win. The two strategies that we were looking for were using enhanced efficiency fertilisers instead of urea. So I'll talk about those the particular products shortly. And also looking at fertiliser rates that were actually based on the productivity zone yield potential, or the block, what used to be called the block unit yield potential, rather than a broader district yield potential. So basically tailoring the fertiliser rates to match the productivity of the block that you were fertilising. We established 8 field trials over the course of the project, sites at Freshwater, Tully, Silkwood, Burdekin and Mackay. And all in all, we've collected 26 crop seasons worth of data. Due to costs, we're only able to conduct runoff monitoring at 2 sites, at Silkwood and at Freshwater. And we've got 7 crop seasons worth of data from those. And this work was supported by some laboratory and field studies to understand the effect of abandoned fertiliser applications on how these EEF products actually perform. Brief details of the field treatments. We typically had 5 treatments at most sites. There was a nil N, an N with a rate applied calculated from the district yield potential calculation using urea. The same product, urea, applied at a rate that was related to the productivity zone yield potential of the block. Sometimes that was lower, as you'll see, and sometimes that was similar to the DYP. We had the same rate, the productivity zone yield potential rate applied as a blend of EEF products. And there was an optional extra treatment there. Most of these, or all of these trials were on farmers' fields, so the farmer or the local agronomist could choose a treatment that they were interested in. The fertilisers, as I said, we used urea. Our EEF treatment was a blend of 2/3 polymer coated or controlled release urea with a purported 90-day release window, and 1/3 urea treated with the nitrification inhibitor DMPP, or marketed as NTEC urea. We chose this particular blend because we wanted to have an extended period of nitrogen protection in soil, given that fertilisers typically applied at a month or so after harvest, and sugarcane takes up nitrogen over a period of 6 months or so, predominantly. So the NTEC or the DMPP nitrification inhibitors just didn't last long enough for that purpose. In the field, we only used the blends, but in the work in the laboratory studies, we looked at both individual products and the blends in isolation. So the field site details, I don't want to dwell on this other than to say that, as you can see, there's the two columns relating to district yield potential and productivity zone yield potential. I think my cursor's going across those two there. You can see in some instances the productivity is quite different between when you use the district yield potential versus the productivity zone. In other cases, it's quite similar, like the sites at Tully. And so the implications for nitrogen rates are sometimes large by coming down to the productivity zone yield potential method, and sometimes there's no change at all. I just want to also emphasise the range of soil types that were present there. So from the clays in the Burdekin through flood irrigated clays in the Burdekin through to some sandy duplexes in Mackay and some soils with different levels of drainage in the Tully area. Just a few quick pickies. So the fertiliser was typically either stool split or side banded. We regularly took biomass samples to measure crop nitrogen uptake. We had replicated strips or small plot trials in most instances, with the exception of the freshwater and silkwood sites where because of the runoff plots, we only had single strips of each treatment, and all trials had 0 N plots. We measured N in the soil as well as in the crop after either during the crop season or after crop harvest, and we measured runoff through large plots or from single or multiple furrows with portable measurement equipment. The laboratory work was banding studies. Typically, most of the work done with EEF products is where the fertilisers have been broadcast and or incorporated into soil. So these type of situations at the top. The sugar industry is working in concentrated subsurface banding. So the bands are widely spaced, so the in-band concentration is high. And that has significant implications for what goes on in and around the band. The top graph here is showing you the sorts of pH changes with time that occur for different products. And as you can see, there's some quite different dynamics in the first 30 or 40 days occurring in and around the band. The same thing occurs for the different nitrogen species. And so we looked at these products in laboratory studies, and there's an example of a band of polymer-coated urea in a soil monolith. And we also looked at a band applied in a field and then looking at the distribution of nitrogen coming out of that band under the effects of natural rainfall. So cutting straight to the chase, the key findings. The first is we've looked at productivity on the basis of cumulative production of sugarcane cane yield. And so there were no effects anywhere on CCS. So sugar yield and cane yield were essentially telling us the same story. So to simplify it, we're talking about cane yields here. And if you look at reducing nitrogen rates below district yield potential calculations, you typically see a small productivity loss. So just to explain the way we're presenting this graph, a number of 1 on the x-axis represents the fertilizer rate that you would apply if you were using the district yield potential calculation. And the yield, a yield of 1 on the y-axis would, so this is representative of the yield that you would get from urea nitrogen applied at the DYP rate. So you can see as we slide down below 1 on the x-axis, our yields are sliding down slightly. And so when we drop to as low as 60%, 60 to 80% of the district yield potential, we're seeing yield productivity losses of in the order of 8 to 10%. And when you're at lower, we drop the rates by smaller margins, the yield reduction is a smaller decline again. So that's urea. When we look at EEFs, you can see that the EEFs being the blue dots on the second graph, you can see that the EEFs have largely performed much the same as urea with a couple of exceptions. And there's 3 ringed situations here where EEF use has increased productivity either at the DYP rate or in this instance here at a rate of 60% of the DYP rate. So essentially we've actually got a yield improvement by using DYP despite the fact we've got quite a large reduction in nitrogen input. So what was special about those 3 sites? The first one, which is the one with the low nitrogen input at Homebush, is a low yielding sandy zone in an otherwise highly productive paddock. And that the EEF treatment resulted in much better fertiliser nitrogen uptake. In fact, more nitrogen uptake in the crop at that site than you got with the district yield potential application rate of urea. The other two sites were at Freshwater and at Silkwood. Both of them applied at DYP rates. And at Freshwater, the yield increases with the EEF products occurred in 2 out of the 3 seasons, and the other season they were the same. Whereas at Silkwood, there were consistent yield increases across all 3 seasons monitored. In both instances, again, we were seeing much bigger increases in fertiliser nitrogen uptake by the crop with the EEF treatments. And again, this is fertiliser nitrogen in the crop in this bottom axis. And as you can see at Silkwood, at Freshwater, the EEFs being the orange, we had much higher nitrogen input out of the fertiliser than we did out of the urea for the same rate. And at Homebush down here, whilst these numbers are pretty unimpressive, or the advantage of the EEF is pretty unimpressive, it's worth remembering that that is 60% of the rate in blue. So it's done pretty well.
Mike, 5 more minutes.
Thank you. The second finding is that EEFs increased the accumulation of fertiliser nitrogen in the crop just about everywhere. And so again, you look at the situation here, the orange dots are the urea, the blue dots are the EEF products or EEF treatments, again on that scale relating to relative nitrogen input. And you can see for the same relative nitrogen input, by and large, the EEF products get more nitrogen into the crop. As we've seen in the previous slide, though, that doesn't necessarily relate to higher yield. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And I think the Mackay site here after the cyclone in 2017 with the serious lodging and crop damage is a classic example where it wouldn't matter if you doubled the nitrogen content in the crop. You weren't going to get much of a productivity increase. The third finding is that the fertiliser N rate has a more consistent effect on runoff losses than moving to EEFs. So the first figure here is looking at reduced fertiliser rates from a DYP rate to a PZYP rate with urea at Silkwood and at Freshwater. And as you can see in both instances, dropping those rates has reduced the total nitrogen loss, cumulative total nitrogen loss across the 3 seasons. The effects of EEFs at those 2 sites were smaller and sometimes variable. So at Freshwater, for example, you can see in both instances, the orange and the yellow, we've got small reductions in runoff losses through use of EEFs compared to urea at the same rates. At Silkwood, we had at the low rate, we had a benefit from EEF use, and at the high rate, we actually increased the runoff losses of total nitrogen. If we look at DIN loads, which is probably a bit more topical, we only had DIN loads from Silkwood, and you look at the 3 different sets of seasonal conditions with the arrows indicating when fertiliser was applied. The first year, fertiliser was applied into dry soil and there were 32 days later, we got the first runoff event. The second year, it was applied into wet soil and we had runoff within 2 days. And the third year was applied into dry soil and there was an extended period until runoff occurred. And so if you look at the actual season 1, season 2 and season 3 impacts on runoff on DIN loads at Silkwood, you see in the first year, we had EEFs gave us a significant reduction. In the second year, there was no change at the higher rate, but a reduction at the lower rate. And in the third year, DIN loads were very small, consistent with the long period before runoff. But at the high rate, again, EEFs yielded a little bit more than they did than urea, but it was reversed at the lower rate. And essentially, what we were seeing here was that the controlled release products like polymer-coated urea were trickling nitrogen out into the soil over an extended period of time. And if the crop was not able to utilise that, as was the case at Silkwood because of waterlogging and high water tables, then that nitrogen was vulnerable to runoff. And so In a situation like that, you would not have got a benefit out of using EEFs consistently. The final finding relates to the lab studies. Banding does influence fertiliser nitrogen dynamics in soil for both urea and the EEFs. Nitrification, that is the process of converting mineral nitrogen through to nitrate, which is the vulnerable form for losses, is delayed by chemical changes associated with urea hydrolysis in the band. So basically nitrate production is slowed, particularly in heavier soils. So when you look at that effect and combine it with high inhibitor concentrations in a banded EEF product like NTEC, the protection afforded by the nitrification inhibitors is extended. So our worry about not long enough protection for our nitrogen fertilisers may have been unfounded because of the banding effect. The nitrogen release from the coated products, on the other hand, is slowed by neighbouring granule effects. And so you pack a lot of granules together, the release rate is much slower. So N comes out over a longer period and is also immediately vulnerable to loss as it's released. So if the crop can't get hold of it immediately, these controlled release products can give problems. So soil type and rainfall collectively play a key role in these effects. So the final slide, the implications for NUE and for water quality. Reducing fertiliser relates below those determined using the 6 easy steps DYP calculation may result in small yield reductions related to reduced crop N uptake if you stick with using urea. EEFs offer a way to enhance fertiliser N recovery by the crop and reduce the risk of yield loss, but they're not going to increase productivity except for particular sets of circumstances. Lowering nitrogen rates and using EEFs can reduce nitrogen runoff losses, but again, effects are site and season specific and rely on the crop being able to capture the additional nitrogen that's conserved. And the productivity benefits of EEF use are unlikely to compensate for higher nitrogen fertiliser costs of these products. So in essence, EEFs are not silver bullets, and further research is required to clarify where you're going to get this win-win of improved nitrogen use efficiency and water quality benefits most frequently. And that's it. Thanks, Jane.
Great, thank you, Mike. I'm not sure if we've got time for questions right now. When we break, we will provide an opportunity for people to ask questions, but also flick anything through the chat menu, please. All right, over to, oops, sorry, just momentarily lost who's next. Yvette.
Thanks very much, Jane. So our project was NESP project 3.12, and we were looking at developing a cybernetic precision irrigation system to optimise irrigation use efficiency with the view to delivering, water quality outcomes. And, specifically, we were looking at both options for increasing productivity and profitability, through the improved irrigation management, which ultimately comes down to looking at, the right amount of water applied at the right time to produce less water running off and less water quality pollutants leaving the ground, and, less overwatering and also less underwatering. So some people underwater and some people overwater, but then there's also some costs associated with water and electricity, and we just wanted to try and optimise those. So there's really two parts to the story of NESP project 3.12, and the first part of the story is around automation, and the second part of the story is around an irrigation decision support system. And so if we look at automation first, we consider that automation is a smart tool. It can automatically turn on and off a pump. It can automatically open and close the valves. A nice feature of the automation is that it does recording automatically for all of the irrigation dates and times and volumes applied. So that's very handy for the farmer not to have to do that manually. And it also knows the size of the area that's going to be irrigated, and it can calculate the millimetres of water that's applied to each field. However, it requires someone to tell the automated tool, which field to irrigate, when to irrigate, and how much to irrigate. So from that end, there are improvements that we need to consider. And so then if we look at IrrigWeb, which is a decision support system to help growers decide how much to irrigate, we're basing it on the cane grow crop model, which is embedded into the IrrigWeb system. It is basically takes in data about soils, weather management to maximise irrigation use efficiency. It's a web-based tool. As noted, it helps with irrigation scheduling, and when the soil reaches a certain deficit, it can indicate when to irrigate, how much to apply, and it just requires those general inputs. It can detect or absorb local weather station data. However, the disadvantage of IrrigWeb and a barrier to adoption is that it requires regular data entries about the information, about the irrigation that was applied to each field. And so as an example, one of our farmers between October 2016 and October 2017 for one paddock had 1,000 irrigation events. And so, that all adds up to time. And so what we were challenged with was to try and get these two technologies to talk to each other, so that the automation knew how much water to apply and when to apply it, and so that IrrigWeb knew when the water was applied and how much water was applied, and that the farmer didn't have to manually supply that data to the system. So the architecture behind our Cybernetic precision irrigation system looks at trying to connect the automated system, which is called WISER, with the IrrigWeb system via this two-way smarter irrigation system. And the stage one is what we've been referring to as uplink, which is about supplying IrrigWeb with how much water was actually applied by the automated system. And stage two is downlink, which takes it from IrrigWeb to the automation system and is able to advise how much water needs to be applied. And then there's other, monitoring type work that can be done just to check that everything is working okay. Some of the farm constraints are that some farmers are on energy tariffs that they want to work around. There is only so much pumping capacity that can be performed by the pumps, and sometimes growers will have to then identify irrigation priorities. So the reason for presenting this slide is that whilst IrrigWeb can say this is how much water you should apply and when you should supply it, there are physical constraints with doing that. And so we worked around those constraints to try and do what was as close as possible to IrrigWeb, but it was not exactly what IrrigWeb suggested. Now, sorry, I'm just got to. Okay, so some other notes, because we're embedding the technology, the expert knowledge into the technology, we're assuming that the farmer trusts the crop model, and thanks to a lot of work that's been done by BPS on the ground, IrrigWeb is fairly well trusted and has been, trialled a lot at small scale. We actually push notification to the farmer so that they actually have the final say if they want to irrigate or not. We're using BBNet, and the automation irrigation software currently only works for Windows. So where we're at the moment is that stage one, which was our uplink, it's fairly stable. It's currently running on 6 farms. still running on 6 farms, even though our project's wrapped up. And everything going well, we're hoping to roll this out further with the GBRF Irrigation Consortium project in the Burdekin. Stage 2 is really at a proof of concept stage. However, we are currently running that on 1 farm, and that does needs more work and investment. So that's really just a snapshot. Very happy to take questions, and would especially like to acknowledge the work by Eric Wang and Steve Addard, who have really done the hard yards with this project, as well as our Burdekin Irrigation Consultative Committee for all of their time to help shape what we've developed. So thanks very much for that, Jane.
Excellent. Thank you, Yvette. That's perfectly timed. We've caught up a little bit. Holton, are there any questions for Yvette before we move along?
Jane, yes, we have one question from Marie Vitelli, which is, what is the cost of the automated irrigation system for supply and install?
So the best bet would be to talk to Steve Addard about the costs for automated irrigation. You know, that's going to vary from farm setup and layout and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, if I could pull out a ballpark figure, you could be looking at around $1,000 per hectare. Might be higher or lower for some farm setups.
Actually, while we are here, perhaps now is a good time to discuss a question that was posed to Mike Bell earlier. If Mike, you're still available, we had a question from John Rolfe, and he was basically saying that the trade-offs between nitrogen reduction and yield in your presentation showed a pretty flat trade-off, but a big barrier for growers is to change variability across seasons. Did you get much of an idea from the project how much variability there is between nitrogen reduction and yield with the differences in rainfalls or seasons of rainfall?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There was a little bit of variability, but I guess I was impressed by the lack of variation in many instances. You know, an example would be the Burdekin site, where we were consistently seeing small reductions for reducing the urea nitrogen rate. It was never statistically significant, but it was always of the order of 3 to 5% less than it was with the DYP rate. And every year we saw the EF product give us exactly the same yield as the DYP rate at the lower application rate. So those sort of effects were fairly consistent. I guess it's unfortunate that we didn't have a big wet season. We had wettish seasons, we had average seasons, but we didn't have an absolute rip snorter of a wet season, which I guess we were hoping would have been a pretty big test of how vulnerable some of these products are. I guess the other point I'd make is that we were applying just about all these products, with the exception of the Burdekin, at very late in the harvest season, and so we were potentially looking at the worst case scenario for nitrogen losses. And so, as has been pointed out by, I think, Kevin in by Chris Johnson in another comment, there's a much broader project looking at this with EEF60 in the Reef Trust 4 program that's looking at a much wider range of application times, soil types and districts that will provide us with a better set of data on that.
Thanks, Mike. And we have one other quick question from Kevin Gale. He says, based on banding results, longer protection and cost, are NI products preferable for further testing, in effect cost neutral at moderately reduced rates CF urea, and how could we incentivize uptake of the technology?
I think that's a really interesting question, Kevin, and one that, short of coming out, I'm not going to come out and publicly endorse NTEC, because I'm not. Yeah, we could get into trouble doing that. But they look really promising. We are getting extended periods of protection. The situation where the NI products probably won't do as good a job are in the lighter textured sandy soils, because as Chelsea's work in the lab and the field has showed, you end up with the inhibitor staying close to the band and the nitrogen diffusing away from the band, and so the inhibitor can't work because the nitrogen transformations are happening elsewhere. But on any heavier soils, the inhibitors, because of the protection and the high concentration we're getting in the band, do an exceptional job. They last a lot longer than we had expected. And I think you're starting to see that in the Reef Trust 4 data that's coming out, and I'm at the risk of going beyond what that project's actually going to generate. The signs at the moment are that the EF products actually perform quite well. The nitrification inhibitor product performs quite well. One of the other disadvantages with the polymer-coated products or the controlled release products is that when the soil dries out, they don't release. So your nitrogen's sitting in a plastic bag. The crop doesn't stop growing, but the nitrogen isn't available. So you can actually have negative impacts of the coated products that you don't see with the inhibitor products. So by and large, inhibitors are the most promising, I think, for the most widespread uses, and they're also the cheapest. So I think, if you can reduce rates a little bit, the extra cost of the inhibitors is not very prohibitive in terms of grower use. So I think there's a lot of potential in that space.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, Jane, I think we'll move on to the next presentation.
Yeah, Nathan's there ready to go now. So Nathan, I'll let you know when you're 10 minutes in.
Okay, thanks, Jane, and I'll go right up to 15 minutes, I think.
Okay.
I'd like to firstly thank a whole range of partners that we've been working with really closely. This is across 2 projects. The first, 2.1.2, which is a mapping and economic assessment. This is desktop work using available data sets. And the question we're asking, the thesis we have, is looking at areas of marginal, low-lying, high DIN risk cane areas in the wet tropics. Firstly, to identify those, and secondly, with the assistance of Jim Smart and team, is to look at the economic analysis and in levers, incentives we could pull or potentially access to achieve land use retirement and transitioning to some other land use. That project was finished, Wet Tropics finished 2017. Those maps are all done and being used by end users, which is great to see, helping them to guide investment projects. We were lucky to extend the work under 5.12 into the dry tropics, so that data is still coming through. I'd like to firstly start by acknowledging that Jane mentioned up front in the introductions that large areas of the coastline, floodplains, have been transitioned to agricultural development, mostly cane. Those wetlands, those coastal areas, those floodplains in themselves, in their own right, hold really important values, not just water quality, but also a range of other services, cultural values, social values, and it's really important to recognise that and be aware of that and identify that very early on in these kinds of projects. We've talked about water quality, and the emphasis here is about looking at using or transitioning coastal areas, cane areas, to restore them back to some sort of other service. The coastal areas I mentioned are important for fishery production, for example. So whilst we've increased agricultural production, we've lost some of these natural values, and that's a real challenge for us if we wanted to think about these types of projects under the UN declaration, which was announced last year. The next decade we're entering into is the decade on ecosystem restoration, and this is a line in the sand where we're saying land use change, developments in the world's ecosystems has pushed these systems to the point of complete loss, or they're under heavy stress. And it's time to reverse that, restore forward some of these values and services. So in coastal systems, this absolutely applies, and the work we've been doing helps GBR network, but then also Australia to hopefully deliver on that UN declaration. This session is about reducing nutrients getting to the reef, and we've heard already a couple of great talks, and I'm excited to hear some of those results coming through, and I've got some questions and some linkages, I think, from our work with Yvette and Mike, which I'll follow up separately. So this really is another tool in the tool belt, I think, in marching towards achieving our water quality targets that Jane mentioned that we are looking to achieve here. Retiring low yield, high DIN cane land is certainly another tool in the tool belt to help us move towards that, and this is exactly what this project was about. To do this, firstly, we needed to come up with a way of identifying exactly where are these marginal low-lying areas in the wet tropics. And when you look in Google Earth, it's not hard to find areas that would be certainly ticking those boxes. I won't say exactly where this location is, but you can see in this time series of images from 2003 to 2016, there's been this increasing water, it's tidal water actually, moving into this property here, and the farmers still in 2016 still trying to get some return on that. So for me, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's those areas that are underwater for long periods, either through flooding or possibly with sea level rise that are coming through. Can we identify those areas and turn that into a water quality improvement opportunity? That's what this project's about. So the wet tropics, we've actually completed that work. This was finished in 2017, so those details are all out and being used, which is great to see. As part of the work, importantly, we set up a program logic, I suppose, a framework which allowed us to work through a series of steps with our partners involved at each of those sites, each of those steps, to eventually work towards phase 2, which I'm excited to talk a little bit about in a minute, whereby we're seeing some of these trials on ground. So we've moved through stages 1 and 2 and 3, and then moving into phase 2, which is the exciting bits, trialing some of these land use retirement transition options. As I mentioned, very much a mapping and data analysis process. We used multi-criteria analysis with available data sets. The data sets needed to be available and mapped consistently across the entire wet tropics and dry tropics. So things like acid sulfate soils, which is a pretty important data sets to use with this kind of project, isn't mapped consistently, so we needed to use surrogate data sets there, which is all outlined in the report. So the criteria we applied were determined and discussed very heavily with our stakeholders. We had a series of workshops with the wet tropics and again the dry tropics to define those criteria for assessing and working out, firstly, where the marginal areas are. As part of that, we also had to look at, well, if we are transitioning these marginal areas to another land use, what actually would work? What would be suitable? Importantly, we don't want to transition to another crop, let's say, that has a higher fertilizer application rate. It defeats the purpose. So we went through a careful exercise of looking at a whole range of alternative cropping that could be a suitable transition. We identified a couple of suitable alternative crops there. We didn't go too far into the economic assessment there because it takes a long time for these crops to reach marketable sizes. With the threat of cyclones and those kinds of things, and the size of the areas we're talking about, these marginal areas, just didn't seem economically sensible. So we didn't pursue that too far. We did look at grazing, and both applying fertilizer to increase or enhance the available grass fields, and also without fertilizer, again, to get that water quality benefit. Grazing would work, and in areas in the wet tropics, and the criteria we put around that, importantly, would need to be of a certain size, a certain number of head of cattle to make it viable. So there's some rules in that that came through. But grazing would be a suitable option to transition to. What was the most interesting and certainly the most encouraging for me was this transition to a wetland, given its low lying. These areas want to be wet, transitioning those areas to wetlands. And we split wetland, the definition, into two terms. One for the purposes of water treatment. And again, this goes back to it defining our services. So the service is for water treatment. And when we did the economics, Jim's team looked at literature values. I suspect these numbers could be refined a bit further with information that's coming out. But effectively, it's around $20 per kilo DIN reduced. That's the cost to the farm or to the project to achieve that water quality outcome. The second definition for wetland we applied was for ecosystem services. And so this, what I mean by that is to transition to an area that might allow fishery production, for example. That might be an ecosystem service. And it turned out to be around about $10 per kilo DIN reduced. So a much more affordable and more exciting opportunity. And the reason for the lower cost there is because it's simply removing bund walls. It could be as simple as that. So the actual cost to do that is much more, is much lower, and therefore providing that ecosystem service. So it's like $10 per kilo DIN reduced. To put that into some context, the Queensland government have available their costs for their extension program, and that's around about $50 per kilo DIN reduced. So I'm not suggesting we stop the extension program, but just to give some context there, that these kinds of options, transitioning these marginal areas to wetlands for either water treatment or for an ecosystem services, look quite favourable. Just to give you some schematics, so what do I mean by a wetland for water treatment? This is removing those low-lying areas and putting in some treatment wetland. Could be a treatment train, possibly, that intercepts the runoff, provides that processing opportunity and improving water quality on the downstream side, getting to our receiving waters. Now, if reef credits are activated, which is quite an interesting opportunity and market mechanism here, I suspect that there could be an opportunity for that funding to move to improving farming efficiency. So a question that quickly came up in our program is you're taking cane out of production and therefore mills might be affected by that. I suspect with these kinds of arrangements that could be achieved, maybe even enhanced if we have this funding mechanism in place, as well as providing that water quality outcome then. What's really exciting is if we look at the ecosystem services, and this is where we talk about bundling some of these payment schemes. So not only reef credits, there's potential water quality benefits there. There's carbon opportunities, blue carbon, if the site's right, and potentially also fishery production as well. So you know, biodiversity type credits, cassowary credits, which is also being looked at quite seriously with restoration projects. So the ecosystem service opportunity there and the potential market mechanisms could be not just for water quality, but there's a number of sources that can be bundled there, which is really quite exciting, as well as achieving the water quality outcomes.
Just a few minutes, Nathan.
When we talk about wetlands, thanks Jane, farmers are building wetlands anyway. When I talk to them directly, they know, and they certainly know about that part of their property that's low lying, and they have to apply a lot of nutrient, a lot of fertilizer to get some return. Building a wetland for fish, let's say, which is an important currency that farmers know and love, they actually get that. So they're very quite excited to look at this as an option moving forward. I mentioned there is some data coming through now where we have actually some wetlands that have been built in the landscape. This is Babinda. This is a really exciting site. It's an off-channel wetland. We entirely understand the hydrology, the denitrification rates. The hydrology is so important for the water quality outcomes. We can fully control that hydrology of that site there. And that NESP report's coming out really soon. It's in the final stages. There's other data coming through for Bakers Creek, which is in Mackay. Reef Catchments have a great program there where they've had auto samplers on the inlet and the outlet to give us an idea of the water quality efficacy. Bradda Creek, BIFMAC have a project and report that's just come out. There's been a few publications looking specifically at soil denitrification, so that information is coming out. And the wet tropics as well with the mix. There's wetlands there, and I've not seen the data yet, but I'm looking forward to reading those results coming out. So we're getting sort of a bit further advanced with thinking now. So as I mentioned, the wet tropics, we've completed that. There's a manuscript in review at the moment, and the report's available, absolutely. The dry tropics, the reports, the NESP report's being finalised and will be available very soon. And so we'll effectively have between Daintree and Serena then mapped in a consistent way of these marginal areas. The dry tropics, I'll just end if I can quickly, Jane. What's interesting and different from the wet tropics is this idea of using recycle pits. I think that's a really good opportunity in the dry tropics to provide that water quality opportunity, and if we can incentivise that through reef credits, I think there's some fantastic opportunities there. And also acknowledging the different climate patterns there. That's probably one of the biggest differences that we've found with the work so far. There are other technology coming through, bioreactors, floating wetlands, algal ponds. I think these are other add-ons to the toolkits coming through. And I'd lastly probably like to sort of finish on that this is a framework that we've built to identify these areas. The costings that have been done, we're continually refining those as more information is becoming available. Those wetland projects that are on ground now are helping us to refine that. A starting point for lots of end users to build wetlands for either wet ecosystem services or water quality outcomes. And I think what's really exciting is activating these market mechanisms that are really on the horizon and coming at us quickly. If we can bundle those, we can achieve multiple outcomes from these kinds of projects. Thanks, Jane.
Excellent. Thank you, Nathan. That's great.
Thank you, Jane. Yvette Effringham, if you're still on the webinar, would you be able to answer this one from Kevin Gale? It's just a quick question. Do we have enough estimates of the water quality benefits of moving to precision irrigation in the absence of improving nitrogen use efficiency? In effect, is this a cost-effective nitrogen loss reduction system compared to improving fertilizer use technology?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that question, Kevin. Can you hear me okay, Halton?
Yes.
Okay. So, Kevin, you know, really great question. You know, what this gives me the opportunity to do is to talk about a new project called Incentivate, which is funded also under the GBRF Reef Trust Partnership. And in that project, we really want to closely have a look at the economics and the water quality benefits from using high precision estimates. Now, also like to say something and just really want to make sure I choose my words carefully. We do have a projected tool out at the moment, which does show you, you know, based on answering certain questions, what the kilogram of N benefit is from different scenarios. And we are concerned that the estimates or the benefits that are suggested from that model from such a high precision irrigation system that, you know, I've just described might be understated. And so as part of this Incentivate project, we would like to look at that more closely as well.
Thanks, Yvette. Thank you for that answer. All right, Aaron, have you sorted out your webcam issues? Are we able to move on to you now?
Okay, well, sorry after that little technical glitch, everyone. Good morning. My name's Aaron Davis, and I'll be giving a fairly rapid-fire overview, I guess, about some of the outcomes from Project 25, which basically revolves around trust frameworks and particularly sugarcane farmers and water quality and practice change. Okay, so I guess unless you've been under a rock for the last few years, or it probably comes as no surprise to people that work in this space that you know, the state of water quality science in the Great Barrier Reef catchment area is it's a really hotly debated and contentious topic at the moment. There's lots of questions from a lot of the key primary industries in the catchment area about the I guess, the quality and in fact the credibility of the science that underpins a lot of our policy and management decisions. And as a lot of you probably know personally, we've just got through a fairly protracted and arduous, Senate inquiry as to the, basically the state of play with regards to water quality science, the Great Barrier Reef, and particularly farming communities. And it's against that sort of background or context that Project 25 basically got off the ground. About 5 years ago now, at the launch of the Tropical Water Quality Hub in Cairns, a number of the really influential and major cane growers from the Russell Mulgrave catchment just south of Cairns convinced the then Environment Minister Greg Hunt that they wanted a water quality monitoring program because of their local concerns about their impacts on the reef and the credibility of the science that was being used to sort of make decisions that affected their farming operations. And ultimately, through Project 25, they got that water quality monitoring program. So we've got the catchment here in the Russell Mulgrave, the end of catchment load monitoring stations run by the Queensland government there in the blue circles. Project 25 monitored water quality at all of those different coloured icons at finer scale through the catchment. But a point I want to make about Project 25 is that, particularly from a scientific perspective, it really wasn't directly about water quality monitoring. That wasn't the main game. It was really more about building trust frameworks with a primary industry, with cane farmers, getting that real rapport and traction with them. It was about developing better science communication around water quality and really trying to push that sort of attitudinal and behavioural change. So because of this, it became a really grower-driven project. It really, from the outset, targeted the big players in the cane farming regions of the Russell Mulgrave. So a lot of the really large, influential growers running really big businesses. Some of them are kind of, tough cookies and perhaps not the sort of guys that are typically swept up in the, for lack of a better word, as low-hanging fruit that you often see in some NRM initiatives. And they make up a big part of the project steering committee. They have sort of the final say in things like program design. What are the questions we wanted answered? Where did we monitor? And a lot of it was just about developing or providing that sort of local data on the impacts of water quality relative to other land uses in the catchment. And while there was that degree of ownership or empowerment that was given to the industry, that also came with some assurances from them that they would act as sort of, they'd endorse the project at the local level, they'd act as advocates, and they'd support it. And they'd take responsibility for issues that when they were identified that were relevant to cane farming and sort of act on them at sort of a local industry level. And basically, in a nutshell, the Russell Mulgrave is quite a simple catchment in some ways in terms of its land uses. And the program itself, in many ways, was looking at basically defining the water quality signatures of often the upper, relatively untouched upper catchments, pristine World Heritage rainforest, and then moving down into the water quality characteristics of a lot of the developed floodplains. So there's urban, mixed land uses, and obviously focusing in particular on some of the key agricultural commodities like sugarcane and bananas. Our water quality sampling methodology was a bit of a mixture of the old and the new. So we still relied quite heavily on, the traditional discrete or grab samples that you collected in a bottle, sent off to the laboratory for analysis, and all of the, communication challenges that sort of approach has with you, where you have got to wait several months before you can communicate results back to farmers. But a big part of the project was really exploring and implementing some fairly cutting-edge nitrate sensing technologies that can provide basically continuous data in real time at a local level back to farmers. But I probably want to point out that there's a lot of work behind the scenes that has to go into sort of translating that really rich data that you can get out of real-time sensors in real time into a form that's, into a, information and knowledge that's relevant and comprehensible to farmers. I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time because of time restrictions on all of the water quality results in their gory detail, which some people probably appreciate. But because of that simplicity of the catchment, we were able to do some really interesting things with the design of the program. We could sort of partition in some of our catchments, the end of catchment loads, into what might be sort of reasonable approximations of the natural background contribution we'd get from things like rainforest, and also the anthropogenic or sort of human impacts on water quality. And yeah, there's a lot of confusion around some of these issues and a lot of lack of clarity with farmers. But we're through that local project and the familiarity with the environment that we're in, the area of farmland that we were monitoring, we could sort of translate some of those numbers into sort of much more relevant local data. So things like in a particular year, there was a DIN yield from sugarcane farming of 8 kilograms per hectare. And the fact that the load reduction targets that are a big part of Reef plan and things like that, it's not about halving your fertilizer rates or anything like that. It's really about cutting that 8 kilograms per hectare for that year by 50 or 60% to meet the load reduction targets, and just making things a little bit more understandable and clear for farmers. We got a lot of good engagement and sort of feedback through that process, and I think alleviated a lot of concerns. I think one of the really exciting outcomes from the project was the utility of the real-time water quality monitoring sensor network. And I've just got a picture of the data from just one wet season from one of our sites up on the slide here. So we've got our stream height in the blue trace there, and our nitrate concentrations from the sensors in the red trace. We've also got some of our lab values there that we use to sort of ground truth the data that we're getting out of the sensors there. And you can see that they provide this really rich, detailed data on dissolved inorganic nitrogen dynamics over the course of a year that we can feed back to farmers. But a really, I think, valuable contribution or collaboration with Project 25 was one that was undertaken with the Csiro Digiscape's Future Science platform. And they had a whole team of people over a number of years that sort of spent a lot of time on the ground and back in the office on developing a web-based platform, the 1622 water quality app, which I'm sure some of you have heard about, which was kind of really aimed at translating that data that we collect from the sensor into sort of an accessible, understandable, relevant form for cane farmers. And I think it was quite a success, and it's really changing the way, in many ways, that we can communicate some of these issues back to the key stakeholders on the coalface of managing water quality. So when we have that sort of data, which tends to be very visual, we can do things like communicating to growers the key risk periods over the course of the year. And we often see those first few rainfall and runoff events after fertilizer application as driving a big part of the annual dissolved inorganic nitrogen load that we get from catchments, which does have some management connotations. When you've got a network of these sensors across the catchment, we can identify hotspots, and we were able to do this in a number of sub-catchments across the Russell Mulgrave that sort of jumped out after several years of monitoring as sort of consistently delivering higher dissolved inorganic nitrogen yields than other areas. And just as a sort of interesting little anecdote of the concept itself, we had a situation at the start of this year when one of the key growers, who's on the project steering committee within one of these hotspot catchments, he rang me during the course of a bit of an early season rainfall event and said, "Oh, look, Aaron, we've got a nitrate spike moving through the catchment here. Do you mind coming?" And we can see where it's coming from. So we proceeded to hop in his ute with a few buckets, drive around the floodplain drainage system, collecting buckets of water, basically. So literally real bucket chemistry. But we were able to identify quite quickly, particular drains and even individual paddocks where it looked like a lot of that spike was sort of coming from. And it wasn't from this particular farmer's farm himself, but he's a fairly influential grower, and he was straight over the fence, for lack of a better word, over the next few weeks on a number of occasions, really sort of liaising with the other farmer about what was going on with the management of that farm, rates and things like that. So it's just a nice little anecdote of the peer pressure aspects of changing practice in a small farming community. When you do have that sort of, you do establish that buy-in and trust with a lot of the stakeholders.
5 more minutes, Aaron.
No worries. So if you do take the time to sort of establish one of these programs and build that sort of collaborative participatory model between scientists and industry, You can, in fact, prove to a farmer that it is my molecule of nitrogen that you're finding in the creek system or moving out into the marine environment, which is a common refrain I'm sure a lot of you have heard from farmers in the area. Prove it's my molecule of nitrogen. And once you've done that, then you can start moving into that, drilling down into those issues of identifying management practices. You know, are the spikes we're seeing in a particular sub-catchment area, is it due to fertilizer rate or excess fertilizer being applied? Is it due simply to timing? Was it just a bad year in terms of a late crush and an early start to the wet season, or just some inopportune major rainfall and runoff events close to fertilizer application? Placement was a big issue in the Russell Mulgrave, and after showing a number of growers this sort of data, some of them actually put their hand up and sort of took a bit of responsibility for some of the spikes that were documented in certain wet seasons, and went and changed their surface applications to subsurface the next year. So as well as sort of identifying problems, you can start to unpack some of those management responses that growers can sort of implement if they take ownership of the problem. Another really valuable aspect of the project, and I can't claim a lot of credit for it, was the collaboration with the CSIRO social research team. So Simon Fielke, Bruce Taylor, Tony Webster to some extent. And I certainly probably can't do their work justice in the time that I have here. It probably deserves its own webinar at some levels. But they undertook sort of a long-term series of repeat interviews with a lot of the Project 25 growers in the steering committee, in the target sub-catchments, and even in some of the neighbouring catchments outside of the Russell Mulgrave. And just as a quick summary, a quick take-home of the results here, they've come up with a bit of a theory of change flow diagram here, if you'd want, of the sequence of events that they see as taking place through time with Project 25. So things from the early agenda building, targeting those big players, the big growers, establishing the local networks and collaborations, a lot of the data sharing, grower empowerment, and then some of the more practical or interesting aspects of the process. So attitudinal change, practice change, and ultimately sort of locally significant cultural change and practice change that we hope leads to water quality improvement. And through that interview process, they were able to identify that we've ticked and completed basically a lot of the early stages of the change logic diagram. Some elements of it are basically what you consider continuous or iterative. They're just sort of a continual thing of collecting and sharing data, working with growers on understanding the relationships between water quality and local farming practices. But I think they have identified that there was actually there was evidence for significant changes in both attitudes, but also on-ground behaviours on the part of a lot of growers in the area, and acting as, changing practices on farm, but also true to their word, they acted as agents of or local influences on with their peers and at the local farming community level. So some quite promising outcomes, I thought. So Project 25, this is a quick summary, I guess. It was really about developing that local scale trust in science to lever into practice change. And in this case, water quality monitoring was just the vehicle that did it in some ways, and providing that local data on agricultural impacts on water quality at spatial and temporal scales that are appropriate to farmer decision making. If you look at the list of recommendations that came out of the Senate inquiry, a large number of them, in at least in part, really relate to this sort of philosophy in some ways about really establishing much better trust frameworks and genuine collaborations between science and farmers, just so that we're all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet in many ways. So hopefully some of the outcomes from Project 25 can provide a bit of a model moving ahead for similar programs, which I think we're almost certainly likely to see. A couple of caveats, I guess, in some ways. Establishing these relationships and the frameworks for behaviour change, it does take time. It takes several years to start getting, significant traction and buy-in, I think, before you start really getting through with some of the messages, and that flows both ways. The project itself is quite resource intensive, and it's really, really multidisciplinary. I was directly involved, but I was surprised with the breadth of expertise that was needed to deliver on some of the outcomes. It wasn't just water quality, it was sensor and instrumentation expertise, Internet of Things expertise, which is obviously not my strong point, as you would have seen already, user experiences of web interfaces, all of these players had to be pulled into the program. On a positive note, I think some of the technology costs are decreasing. The sensors are sort of slowly but surely decreasing in cost, so it's probably becoming much more accessible and achievable in that respect. And I guess as a bit of an endorsement for the model itself, we had some of the other major cane growing districts in the Great Barrier Reef catchment directly approach Tropwater because of recommendations from the Russell Mulgrave to roll out very similar programs to Project 25 in their particular cane farming districts. And hopefully we'll be getting some of them off the ground in major catchments like the Lower Herbert at the early stages of next year, and possibly some more into the future, depending on the success of funding proposals. And obviously just finish up with a few acknowledgements. Obviously the Tropical Water Quality Hub, RRC, for their support. Cane growers at a whole range of different levels, and as you've probably gathered, Csiro were a really valuable collaborator for this project. Thanks, Janie.
Great, thank you, Aaron. We are actually running 15 minutes behind, so what I suggest we do is just do 5 minutes of questions now. In that time, if anybody needs to jump up and have a quick break, please do that, and then we'll aim to reconvene at 10:35, and that will be Jim's presentation. So if we, Holton, just to you, if you want to go through some of those questions that are outstanding there, starting with Aaron's.
Thanks, Jane. We'll start with Aaron's just to keep it fresh. And Billy Gordon, thanks, Aaron, for your insight. Just wondering if you can share any quantifiable changes that took place in Project 25. Billy, I'm not sure if your question is referring to water quality changes or practice changes, but I'll let Aaron address both of those things.
Yeah, I was probably going to ask the same question, to be honest, Holton. It depends, and thanks for the question, Billy. In terms of attitudinal and behavioural changes, we're just sort of finalised. Csiro has already presented me basically their final report for the social research component, and they have sort of documented some really, as I sort of said, some significant attitudinal changes at a local level there around water quality and ownership of some of these issues. The impacts on, I guess, practice change and water quality are probably a little bit tenuous, a little bit more tenuous to identify, because as you probably know, it's difficult to quantify water quality changes, especially occurring over the short term. And I'm actually grappling with some of the, I guess, behavioural or practice changes within some of the catchments too. I've actually got a phone call with some of the growers, or sorry, the local extension staff there in the area, trying to unpack how we quantify practice change directly due to Project 25 there, because as you know, these things just aren't happening in a vacuum, and there's actually been a whole range of different projects, extension projects that have actually rolled out in the catchment as well in the last year or two. I'll have to get back to you possibly on that practice change question through Paddock to Reef, if that's a specific one. I think we've got some good practice change according to the cane growers BMP accreditation. I know the local cane growers extension staff have put a lot of effort in some of the hotspot catchments of late, bringing a number of the growers there into up to BMP standard just in the last, even in the last 6 months and things like that. And that's one of the sort of things I'll be trying to quantify.
While you're reading it, Aaron, I'll just read it out to everyone. OGBR have some similar projects, but not as heavily resourced with scientists, instrumentation, etc. Therefore, taking the conversation into the controversial space, acknowledging that it is coming from the farm is very challenging. They are keen to know, could discuss it later, what are the key attributes of successful collaboration leading to ownership of the issues that could be replicated in this project.
I'm not sure I can answer that really quickly and succinctly. Holton, happy to chat to Alicia at any stage in a bit more detail about this, and I'm trying to sort of capture some of these attributes myself right now in writing my final report. But look, I think that you've really got to come at this from a grassroots level in some ways, and just be really open to a lot of the growers, the questions that they want answered and their concerns about water quality, because there's even a few things that have come out of this program myself that I was kind of a bit dismissive of at the start in terms of industry concerns about different things. But once we actually started looking at a couple of those questions, you know, some of there was actual, I think, water quality findings and things like that, which probably did underline that some of these concerns weren't entirely unfounded. And I think as long as you come into this thing where it's not entirely a finger-pointing exercise solely at the sugar industry, and sort of frame it more as a, you know, water quality is a catchment-wide responsibility for everyone, you tend to, you know, they tend to be much more open to taking responsibility for their problems, but also not being tarred with, you know, caught up in blame for things that aren't actually their responsibility. So it's kind of a difficult question to answer succinctly. Alicia, hopefully I'll provide that in the final report.
Thanks, Aaron. Anyone else, if they have specific questions relating to any of these presentations, are welcome to contact the project leaders directly as well offline. I'll just go back to one other question in the chat that was posed to Nathan Altman earlier. And if Nathan, you are still in the webinar, and I'm not sure if you have read that question yet, but it was a question from Murray Vitelli asking if you had factored in the cost and regulatory process for riverine protection permits required under the Water Quality Act in Queensland, etc. If that expense or cost was taken into consideration for the wetland work that you're doing.
It's a really good question, at least for my research project. Yeah, thanks for that. The modelling and mapping we did was at the high level, and there are going to be local nuances that need to be considered. There's site constraints, for example. Hydrology mightn't necessarily provide the greatest opportunity to build a wetland, let's say, for example. So the short answer is no, but I think we do recognise that there are lots of local considerations that we would need and hoops to move through, I guess. That being one, there are others that came to mind as well through the project. I think those costs, they're real costs, they need to be factored into projects, and I think under that, for that reason, they would certainly need to be picked up. As I say, there are other things I think can come up as well. Fish passage, for example, not just riparian rights as well there. So, yeah.
Thank you, Nathan. All right, so in the interest of time, we will have to move on. I did notice that there was another question from John Rolfe to Aaron in relation to his presentation. Aaron, if you are able to address that in the chat directly to everyone in response to John, that might be a quicker way to get that response to the webinar. In the meantime, we'll now move on to the next presenter, who I believe is Jim Smart.
Yes, so hello everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about these projects this morning. These are projects, as all the ones we're talking about are, that are funded by the federal government through the NESP Tropical Water Quality Hub. The second of the two projects is one that's also been jointly funded by the Queensland Government's Office of the Great Barrier Reef. And both of these projects, we're talking about trading in water quality credits in one way or another. The first of them, the one on the left-hand side here, was completed a while ago in 2016. That one looked at a potential mechanism where individual farms could trade nitrogen loss rights effectively. Could trade DIN rights between them. The second one, the one on the right-hand side, instead of looking at that side of things, it looked very much forward. It looked forward to a place we're not at yet, which is the position where we've already achieved the Reef 2050 water quality targets, but where we don't want those targets necessarily to act as a handbrake on economic development in the region. So we still want to have more people, more urban development, bigger sewage treatment plants, etc. But we don't want to damage the reef in doing it. So the question that the more recent project looked at is, could trading in water quality credits be a way of facilitating that future economic development without driving a cart and horses through the reef water quality targets, which had by that point already been met? So those were the issues that those two projects looked at. For this morning, what I'm doing is I'm taking learnings primarily from the more recent of those projects, but really to try and answer this question, which is the one that Jane and the nutrient synthesis team have asked me to think about for this morning, which is when we think about trading in nitrogen or DIN credits, would this potentially provide an alternative mechanism for farm scale nitrogen reduction? And as you'll see here, this work's benefited from inputs from a very wide range of people, of whom I'm only one. So I'm very grateful to the team here for this. So let's try and have a look at that particular question. So the real focus here is on the farm end of things, where farmers would potentially be able to supply DIN credits. So that's DIN credits, that's benefits that would arise that could be quantifiable in terms of reduction in the DIN losses from their cane fields. And there are two main ways in which they could do it, both of which we've already heard about. Like Mike talked about early this morning, they could reduce their nitrogen applications or potentially switch to higher efficiency fertilizers instead of urea. And as Nathan was talking about, they could potentially change the usage of some of their existing cane land to other low nitrogen land uses. So either of those mechanisms could potentially allow farmers to reduce the runoff from their fields, if provided that the DIN reductions could be validated in some way. Those DIN reductions could appear as credits, DIN credits, which somebody could buy and pay the farmers for. Now I've grayed out the box at the top there because that's the actual loop, the mechanism that would link the supply of the credits to the buyers and then the payments for the credits coming back to the farmers. There's a lot in the Project 3.1.6 report that deals with what's in the grey box there, but for today's question, could this process help incentivize reductions in nitrogen loss from farms? It's really about the bit that's in white at the bottom here. Will these payments from DIN credits help incentivize reductions in DIN loss from farms? So that's the first question we're going to deal with today. A second one, which is sitting behind it though, is could these payments from DIN credits from this type of mechanism reduce end of catchment DIN loads? And as we'll see in the next few minutes, those are actually somewhat separate questions. So let's go after the first one. Can payments from DIN credits assist farm scale nitrogen reduction? So within Project 3.1.6, one of the things we looked at in quite a bit of detail was how much would it cost potentially for farmers to supply DIN credits if they have to go through the types of change in fertilizer practice or change in land use practice that we've mentioned there. And here we were fortunate to benefit from very detailed data from on predictions of DIN loss under different levels of fertilizer application that comes from the paddock to reef AppSim modeling. Within that modeling, all of the cane land in well, all along the reef coast, but we were focused on the wet tropics. So the cane land there is divided up into distinct management units based on unique combinations of soil type, soil permeability, climate zone, and subcatchment. So our modeling looked at 563 separate management units across the wet tropics. And here's just a blow up version of that. You can see that looking on the right-hand side there, some of those individual management units are almost paddock scale. They're quite small. And for each of those management units, the paddock to reef modeling provided us with estimates of cane yield and predictions of DIN losses to runoff and to drainage over 27 years. That's from 1987 through to 2013. And that run of data allowed us to produce two things. It allowed us to produce the average cane yields and average DIN losses for each of these management units across those 27 years. But also, we were very kindly given individual year-specific data. And this was something that John asked about earlier. We're interested in seeing the variation year to year on the same management unit of a given reduction in fertilizer or change of land use. So what changes were we looking at? We were, this as I'm sure you're familiar with, is the water quality risk framework, and we were looking at two levels of change. We had to get to where you can see the green highlighting there, and that's what in Mike's talk he called productivity zone yield potential as the basis for fertilizer applications. So we'd have to get either from a 6 easy steps type of district yield potential a calculation of fertilizer applications to an actual yield history based calculation of fertilizer applications. So we'd have to go either from the cream area to the green area, or we'd have to go from a higher fertilizer application rate than the cream area across to the green area. So we're looking at those two potential changes. And what did we find? When we looked at those data we were provided with, and we look at the average cane yields, we're heading for what was the green area on the previous slide is the bottom right box here, and the upper row here are the heavier fertilizer applications. The lower left one here is the full, sorry, let me get the name right, the moderate risk area, the cream one. The upper row here are those red ones. And what we're showing here is cane yield along the horizontal axis for different soil types. And we're getting a spread here because we've got multiple of these management zones in different soil types. And what we see here is, generally speaking, as you make those improvements in fertilizer management practice, you can hardly see the reductions in average cane yield. That's not the case for DIN though. If we look at the average across year DIN losses, as we move towards that green position we were looking at, we see some very substantial reductions in average across year DIN loss. When we look at the year specific data, first thing we notice is that it's a lot noisier. There are some years in which you get this is the cane yield data, some years in which you get particularly low cane yields. But again, the general story is the same. As you improve towards that desired endpoint for fertilizer application practice, you don't see a big reduction in the cane yields, but you do see a big reduction in the DIN loss. Although in some years when the weather is particularly against you, and this is again something Mike pointed out, if the weather is particularly against you, you might still get relatively high DIN losses on occasion, even with the much improved fertilizer management practice. So armed with that information, we look to see how much do we think it would have cost those farmers to make those changes, because that's the minimum amount they'd be willing to accept in terms of a payment for the DIN credits that were generated from those changes. And here we put together 4 different types of cost. We put together the opportunity cost, that's the potential loss in their gross margin because the cane yield might have gone down, but we make allowance for the fact that they're buying less fertilizer and paying for less. We also look at compensation that they might want for increased exposure to the risk of a low yield coming along. If they're worried about potentially there being a really good year and they might miss out on it because they haven't put as much fertilizer on as they used to, there's a compensation element to cover that. There's also costs of buying new equipment, subsurface fertilizer application, variable rate fertilizer boxes, that sort of stuff. That's the transition cost. And also there's transaction cost, the actual hassle and time that the farmers have to engage in to get involved with this type of scheme. So we estimate all those things, add them up, and here's an example for the sum of all of those costs for one of our 120 hectares coombe soil management unit in the Johnson catchment. And here, as we go down this table, we see the levels, we see the actual DIN reductions that we get for making each step of fertilizer improvement there. The levels of cost that the farmer would incur in making those changes, and we turn those into a cost per kilogram of DIN reduced at end of catchment. And what we see is the early steps are very low cost, getting the final step that takes us from the cream to the green on that practice improvement. In this case, it's still relatively low cost, but if you have to push harder than that, it gets very expensive per kilogram of DIN, because there's not much DIN reduction, not much further DIN reduction to be achieved, and it gets really expensive to squeeze that last bit of DIN reduction out.
Jim,
So we could,
just a few more minutes.
yeah, thank you, Jane. So we can represent that on a curve like this, where we look on the horizontal axis at the total amount of DIN reduction that could be delivered through these practice changes, and the costs of, we've ordered those DIN reductions from the lowest cost to deliver to the highest cost to deliver, and we can see that if we tried to push towards that green level of fertilizer management, we start getting to it in the best situations at about $10 a kilo. But if we try and push everybody through to that point, it'll be costing about $60 a kilo DIN. So that's sort of the range of prices that we'd expect to see farmers wanting for DIN credits. Now, the other mechanism we talked about was the change of land use, for example, to on-farm treatment wetlands. This is very like the work that Nathan talked about. The difference here is we've got some newer data from the Wet Tropics MIP that were kindly shared with us from Terrain NRM, Suzette Argent, and Mark Bailey, Australian Wetlands Consulting. And these data were on the actual costs of constructing wetlands through the Wet Tropics MIP. And again, with some literature-based estimates of the DIN reduction rates, we're able to estimate how much it costs per kilogram of DIN on an annual basis to achieve DIN reductions through wetlands, to source DIN credits through wetlands. And here we're at the range $15 to $35 a kilo. So to try and round off here, can payments for DIN credits assist farm scale nitrogen reduction? Yes, they definitely can, particularly on the right soil type, permeability, and climate combination. So on appropriate soil types and permeabilities and climate zones, payments of the order of $10 to $25 a kilogram DIN should be able to begin to incentivize people to move from the older fertilizer practices across to that moderate low risk practice. Similarly, similar sorts of ranges of payments for DIN credits could be sufficient to incentivize land conversion across to farm scale treatment wetlands. But just the second question, can payments for DIN credits help reduce end of catchment loads? Now here we've got to be careful. That depends on who buys the credits. If the credits are being bought by emitting buyers to use as offsets against their exceedances, their increased levels of nitrogen emission, then clearly if you're just offsetting an increase from somewhere else, you're not actually reducing an overall level of DIN reduction from a catchment. What you are doing is you're holding the line. And that was the type of thing we had in mind for the future expansion. You know, we do future economic expansion once the Reef 2050 targets have been met. This type of offsetting mechanism with emitting buyers paying for these credits could hold the line, but it won't reduce your end of catchment DIN loads. However, if your DIN credits are bought by non-emitting buyers, bought by buyers who are not dumping nitrogen into the catchment, then indeed you can get a reduction in end of catchment load. So if you can persuade Qantas or Palmolive or other entities who are not emitting nitrogen to buy these credits at the sort of prices that we've been talking about, then yes, you could get this mechanism, payments for water quality credits, for DIN credits, helping to reduce end of catchment DIN loads. Yep, sorry. And this is the specifics for the future that I talked about. So this mechanism could help that future once we've achieved Reef 2050 water quality targets. These offsetting mechanisms and the pricing that we've been looking at there seems to be of an order where the entities like sewage treatment plants, urban development and aquaculture that would power economic expansion in that future, they'd probably be willing to pay that much for these credits. And there's a lot of more on that in project 3.1.6. But I hope that's given a really quick view of the types of insight that we were getting from the trading projects into this area. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Jim. Well done for condensing that into just 15 minutes. There's a lot of work there, and I can say the reports are very comprehensive and worth looking at as well. Now we're going to hear, we'll park questions, or if people can please send them through on the chat line so we can come back to them. But we're going to hand over to Peter now, who's going to talk about their insurance project.
Oh, hello, everybody. Sorry, I sort of joined at the end of Aaron's talk because we're actually talking to farmers about the follow-on work, the follow-on to this project this morning. So I missed the first half, so apologies for that, but you know, we're doing that for good reason. So this is project 3.1.8, which has got the rather arcane title of Exploring Economic Levers, blah, 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 blah. In plain English, really the question we ask is whether insurance can help farmers reduce the impact of nitrogen pollution from their intensive cropping. And I've sort of framed that question quite generally because while what we've done is been specific for sugarcane, it could be applied to any other crop and other places as well. So I suppose to do this, we're sort of realising that farmers' nitrogen management can be framed as a risk management issue, that you know, the lower you, the less nitrogen you apply to a crop nitrogen fertiliser, the greater the chance its yield will be limited by insufficient nitrogen supply. And hence it raises the risk, lower rates raise the risk of N loss, so of yield loss, sorry. So this is the risk framing. And this is the sort of a universal truth in agriculture that for high value crops, farmers over-apply inputs, be them nitrogen fertiliser or other things, as a way to manage the risk. And often this doesn't really worry society, but you know, when you do that, however, you do have an environmental impact. And so, you know, these issues obviously come to the fore in places where, you know, environmental impacts are of a worry. So, you know, this leads to the question, if we have this risk framing, can we go from over-application of nitrogen as a risk management strategy to insurance as a risk management strategy? Because insurance is commonly used on a lot of, throughout society to manage risk. So I started off by looking at the current types of crop insurance. I've got crop in inverted commas because some of these are broadly crop insurance, but they're not necessarily directed crop insurance. And the existing products, which are in the black boxes, fall into these three broad categories. The most common, and the history of crop insurance actually goes back to the 1600s. The most common is specified perils, so like hail insurance or frost insurance, or in sugarcane, the common one is fire insurance, because you don't, you know, when a crop is burnt a long time before it's harvested, it dies and farmers lose money. The other thing that the evolution in insurance was multi-peril insurance. So you can see that we're going from a specific peril, so a single peril, to multiple ones. And this sort of forms itself in the way of saying the insurance company doesn't really care about what's reduced the yield of that crop, you know, but you'll get a payout. These are really quite popular around the world. They're very big in America. but they're also expensive and they're subsidised. Part of the reason they're expensive is actually quite a lot of sort of footwork to have people running around, working out that farmers have managed their crops properly and, you know, farmers doing the right thing. How do you assess whether a loss has happened? And all of that adds inefficiency and cost to the product. So there's been a trend to index insurance. So if, for example, we say think of a wheat crop in southern Australia, a really huge determinant of the yield of that crop is the amount of rainfall it gets. And so you can quite easily go onto the web and buy insurance for a particular amount of rainfall in a specified time at a Bureau of Meteorology rain station. And really, most crop insurance is moving in this direction because they're very efficient products to offer, and therefore they tend to be cheaper. A problem they have there is that, you know, the potential lack of correlation between the rainfall at the Bureau of Met rain station and on the farm, or the fact that there might be more determinants of crop yield than rain or temperature or something. And that's certainly the case for sugarcane. A simple index like this isn't really well related. But we not only have these factors that I've just talked about to consider, we're actually, these previous products are about managing the risk of attaining a certain yield rather than the impact of a management practice change on productivity. So there was no product, as far as we could see, this had never been tried, and certainly nothing that could be directly transferred to sugarcane. So you had to build a product from scratch. So quickly, the three things that you need to look at, you've got to come up with methods for quantifying the risk of loss, which gives you the base price for the product. The ways of assessing whether a loss has occurred, which is to do with the efficiency with which the product can be offered, and that affects the cost as well. You've got to see whether their losses in a region are correlated. So, you know, if you have a drought in southern Australia, say Western Australia is in drought, and all the wheat farmers in Western Australia have multi-peril yield insurance, then every one of those will be making a claim. And the insurance industry has ways of creating pools of money so that they can pay out with things, you know, with a high number of claims, but those come at a cost, so that increases the product cost. And then you have a lot of particular hazards. I've listed three there, I won't describe them, and they also impact on the sort of commercial viability of the product. So we had to sort through these things and come out with a methodology. And there are ways of sort of delivering this information. One is creating products that are empirical based on like experimental type data, and then other approaches which are more based on modelling, sort of like the rainfall index that I talked about in the previous slide, the model based. And we chose the parametric approach because there were data, there just wasn't the data available within the cane industry to be able to quantify risk of loss, for example. To have some experimental system where you came and tried to assess loss empirically would have been incredibly expensive, and it just would have meant that we had a product that was so expensive that wasn't going to get off the ground. So we chose the parametric route. So this is based on modelling, and I suppose for us it was easy to go down this route because of the existence of and our experience with AppSim. You have two phases. First is looking back and looking at the historical data for how yield would change with different rates of nitrogen. So this gives you your risk and your fundamental basis of pricing the product. So in this case, you get historical climate, and we had 70 years of that, and you're simulating the risk of yield loss. So the probability of a loss is a function of not only the climate in which the crop grew, but the soil type on which it was growing, and some management variables. A key one of those is whether the crop was harvested early, and thus the following crop started early in the season, or harvested late. And then you come into a more operational system of loss assessment, where so somebody might buy a policy for a late harvested crop now. 12 months later, come back, you actually see the season that crop experienced, the weather that it grew up in, and with that weather and knowing the difference in nitrogen rate, its soil, the management things, which are all determined in the grey box. You run that through, and you get determine whether you've got a loss or not. And as an example of the efficiency, this could all be offered via the web as you go on. Most of us buy a car insurance that way now. You know, you wouldn't require someone from an insurance company driving around the width and breadth of the cane industry, which would come at a considerable cost.
Peter.
Thanks. I think this is my second last slide. We've developed a prototype, this up to a prototype level for the wet tropics. It operates sort of at the individual field level because the risks are heterogeneous at that level. If we tried to operate at a district level, say the whole of the Tully region, it would just lose all credibility. And the concept, it's conceptually transferable to other regions, other risks. For example, we could have something that's based on just yield itself, not yield as a function of nitrogen. And as I said, it's a simulation-based approach. We underwent in the project, user testing both with the industry, and the bottom is a photo of a workshop we ran in Cairns, and also with the insurance industry. So we sort of made a bit of a partnership with Willis Towers Watson, who became a strong supporter, and they're actually a collaborator in the new project. And we presented the idea and talked and got feedback with 6 international reinsurance companies, which basically you don't get them over the line, nothing's going to happen. And here's a photo from a meeting that Willis Towers Watson facilitated for me with AXA Climate, and there's both AXA people and Willis Towers Watson people in that photo. So in conclusion, it's a viable approach. We know from an insurance theory point of view, it stacks up, it ticks the boxes. Farmers haven't poked any holes in what we're doing. It accounts for variability and risk through all these different levels, which is important. And the other advantage that we have is that the savings on N-fertilizer functional subsidy. So given that 20 kilograms of nitrogen costs about $30, so for example, if a premium for a 20 kilogram reduction was less than $30, it's actually economically rational for a farmer to take out that insurance. And this thing about systemic risk, correlated risks, looks like it's actually a lot lower, a lot smaller than tends to happen with crop insurance products. So that's a positive. But we've got obstacles to commercialization. Parametric insurance is pretty abstract concept. It's a hard sell. To support that, you need local capacity building and support. And there's obviously the industry resistance. Whenever we go and talk to people about low nitrogen rates, their knee-jerk reaction to assume that there must be a reduction in productivity, which has impacts particularly across the sugarcane value chain. So people like harvesters get paid per tonne of cane, millers, work on tonnes of cane. So, this fear about loss of production is something we really do have to overcome here. So on that, I'll conclude. I think there's one more thing. Yes, and we've got funding from the foundation to actually take this prototype and assess its viability in more detail. Thanks, Jane.
Great, thanks, Peter. It's really interesting and innovative idea to have an insurance program just for that. I guess to address the nitrogen reduction issues that we're having. We've probably got time just for one question for Peter. I don't see any in the chat. So we might keep going. Thank you. John, are you ready to go? Thank you.
All good. Okay. So, so we had a small NESP project looking at the cost effectiveness. So we started this back in 2015, so right at the early days. And I know a lot more now than I did then. So this is very much a bit of an exploratory project. But anyway, I'll talk through what we found. Got to find a way of going to the next slide here. Is that coming through in my slide? Slide change coming through?
No, you might need to use the keyboard arrows I've found. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so the things that we found was that the cost effectiveness varies really widely. And we're just measuring the dollars per kilogram of DIN reduced. And there's a whole heap of factors, including difference in costs and farm differences and the various costs that are included, time lags, etc. Now, from some of the different work that's been done by us, by some of the department approaches, and by other groups such as Hugh Possingham's group, we reckon that if we could only prioritise better, select the more cost-effective projects, we'd probably get a lot more environmental benefits for the money that we're spending. So our estimates were that you could improve the outputs by about 2.5 times. Hugh Possingham's group had a bit of a go at the same sort of exercise, and they reckon that the potential improvements could be up to 4 times if we could only prioritise a little bit better which projects we're selecting. So that's the case. When the Water Quality Science program reported back in 2016, they had a bit of a go at estimating what the costs of making management improvements would be. This is for DIN reduction in cane. And you can see there's a whole heap of changes in some catchments in the Burdick and the wet tropics, where it should be in farmers' interests to make improvements, and then there's a whole heap that are virtually zero cost, and then a whole heap that are positive cost. I think regulations knocked out pretty well all the low cost changes, and so we're now into the positive cost changes. So over time, our expected costs of change are probably increasing as we're looking now to go from C to B or B to A, or more precisely in some of the other presentations. So we had a bit of a go at summarising what the different programs were predicting the cost changes to be, and we also did some analysis of the costs and outcomes of the Reef rescue grants. We had a cooperation with the Paddock to Reef group and support from the Commonwealth in allowing us to have access to the data. So I'll just talk through some of those outcomes quickly. When we had an analysis of what the different programs were predicting the costs could be, we found huge variation in the predictions when you put them side by side. And we also found that, perhaps unsurprisingly, the costs of the predictions of future costs were much lower than what the analysis of past costs had been. So it was as though the different programs and the NRM groups involved were very optimistic about future costs and relative to past experiences. And this was mostly because people didn't have really good knowledge. But it's surprising in some ways, because what happens in these programs is you typically address your low-hanging fruits first. So you get your cheapest programs done first, and then it gets more and more expensive. And I think that's the space that we're in now in the Great Barrier Reef.
Please, fire alarm evacuation tones and bells are about to be tested. There's no need for an evacuation. This is a test, and therefore no need to evacuate.
That's my system here, so I'll have to go to mute when it gets to the worst of it. Okay, so then we summarise this across the different programs. Okay, and across a whole heap of different water quality improvement plans, some of as compared to what had been achieved, we found that the water quality improvement plans generally look to be pretty expensive, and we made recommendations for a cap, so some sort of a benchmark to select projects with. Now we suggested that it should be the benchmark should be $150 a kilogram. That's for the first year of reduction. So if you annualize that, so you make it, what's the dollars per year, per kilogram per year, depending on your discount rate, you come down to around about $9 or to $15 a kilogram annualized. And back in our original report, I should have explained that a little bit better, because most of the programs now and analysing the cost effectiveness in annual terms. So the second thing that we did, just got my keyboard stuck here. The second thing we did was we analysed the Reef Rescue Program. So this is where we were given access to the de-identified data for reef rescue grants for cane over 2 financial years. And with help from the Paddock to Reef team, we were able to compare for each project that had been funded, how much money had been given to growers and what was the predicted reduction in DIN that was achieved from that. The analysis was actually quite tricky because the projects had multiple outputs, so sediment reduction, DIN reduction, pesticide reduction. So we had to come up with a way of splitting out the allocations between those reductions, which we did through a modelling approach. And what we generated was basically a plot of the cost effectiveness of the bids. They're very similar to what Jim presented before. These plots are typically in a reverse L shape, so you get really, really cost-effective projects first, and then very ineffective ones last. So what we've done here is we've ordered them. We've put the cheapest, best value project first, going along the horizontal axis, and added them. So as you go along that horizontal axis, it's cumulative reductions in DIN, and the projects get more and more expensive. And you can see it turns a corner, and the last mob of projects just basically are expensive and hardly add anything to DIN reductions. Now, you can see here that across the Reef Rescue Program, we estimated that the average cost this is back 2015, was $6.89 a kilogram, which looks pretty good against our benchmark. It's still a fair bit more expensive than the reverse tenders that operated in a few years after that. And it's probably, when you consider that some of the projects were to get growers from D to C or D to B type of standards, Some of them probably were expensive. But the key thing here is that there were a whole heap, the first half of those projects only cost $2.92 a kilogram. So there's a lot that were really, really cost effective. And then there were a bunch at the end that were very ineffective. So if you could have selected better, you would have achieved more for the funding. So we've done a lot of other work since then on prioritisation. We've got a lot better information about cost effectiveness, and I think our understanding is improving. But the key problems, or the key issues still are that there's really big variations in cost effectiveness, and that really underpins this case for better project selection and better prioritisation. And the presentation from Jim before about some sort of a selection method is a way of trying to automate that project selection so that the growers with the cheapest costs of change are the ones that then win the tender or win the offset in any sort of a competitive process. The other things that we discovered was that our understanding of why some projects are more cost effective than others was pretty limited. We just didn't have enough information about the different projects. And we also discovered that different programs measure cost effectiveness in different ways. So some just measure the direct cost of growers, say, purchasing equipment and machinery, whereas others will include the administrative costs or the engagement costs. So this is one of the really big challenges in assessing cost effectiveness, that it's not very consistent. Some programs will report the reductions as the total amount of reduction, you know, the tonnes of DIN that's been reduced, whereas others will report it in annual terms, the kilograms of DIN reduction each year. That's particularly a problem when we come to sediment, not so much of a problem when we come to DIN, but getting consistency is a challenge. And the third big message was we found it difficult to reconcile these measures between when we were looking at evaluation of programs that had occurred in the past and forecasts for costs of programs into the future. And something that I haven't talked about here is what we've done here is we've basically evaluated programs, but we haven't compared it here to the costs that are coming out of farm production models, which one of the earlier presentations talked about. Now that generates some slightly different results as well, sometimes more expensive, sometimes cheaper, and that's another set of evaluations that I think is important to do. So this was a preliminary bit of work we did about 4 years ago, and started to get to thinking about some of the issues here, and it's sort of the tip of the iceberg, not the right way, but it's the first effort into something that needs a lot more attention. And I'll leave it there, Jane.
Excellent, thank you, John. There is a question there, and I've condensed my conclusions right down to something I think I can do in 5 minutes. So, Holton.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, John. This question is from Nick Welch, and he asks, John, how cost-effective are gully or stream bank remediation projects at reducing nitrogen at the coast?
So we didn't touch the sediment in this project, but we have looked at cost effectiveness of gullies in other projects. The answer is that they vary really, really widely, and essentially they vary widely because of the various different types of techniques, as well as factors like different delivery ratios. Essentially what we're missing, or what is really hard to deal with in gullies, is getting a good estimate of the effectiveness. So my recommendations at the moment with gullies are to treat them as two groups. So one are the major gullies, which require the engineering type of solutions, and the second are the smaller gullies, which are often dealt with at the farm scale with, through things like contour ripping. I think it's really hard to compare those two groups because I don't think we've got a really good measure of effectiveness. Certainly the engineering type solutions much more expensive, but much more effective, particularly when you take into account risks of future events. The farm one's really cheap, but at this stage, I think it's hard to really measure the effectiveness properly. Although the Gully Toolbox is the place to start when you're trying to assess these.
Thanks, John. And yeah, I would recommend that anyone else who's interested in that area check out the webinar yesterday on reducing sediment to the reef, because that also discussed some gully remediation effectiveness techniques too. All right, Jane, I'll let you complete the webinar with your summary and conclusions.
Oh, thank you, Holton. Okay. So I'm going to whip through what I think are some of the highlights from the presentations that we've had today, but I would encourage you to stay in contact with the researchers, and when their final reports come out, some of course are already published, and then also when our synthesis products and technical report are ready, this is something that will be within that. So on that, the body of work around practices for nitrogen reduction, we heard from Mike that lowering nitrogen rates and using EFs can reduce nitrogen runoff losses without reducing yields. But he also noted, really importantly, the effects are quite site and season specific, and they rely on the crop being able to capture the additional nitrogen. I think his conclusion was that they're not a silver bullet, but they will be successful in some locations and circumstances. They need to be used in a way that maximises their effectiveness, so knowledge of the dynamics of that system is really important, and then integrated with other management operations. We heard from Yvette about a very sophisticated decision support tool that's been developed. So they've integrated 2 platforms to be able to answer the questions about how much water does the crop need, when does it need it, and how can this be done in a practical way. So this is something that farmers have been grappling with in some of the systems in the Lower Burdekin, and so working with their team, they've worked to develop a tool that can help them, I guess, improve water efficiency and therefore reduce runoff and nitrogen losses. From Nathan, we heard about options for retiring the low yield, high nitrogen producing cane areas. So from that, they found generally the wetland restoration or the constructed treatment wetlands are the most cost effective option, when as long as the conversion costs are low, and it gives an indication, and the more results are showing that the DIN removal capacity is high in certain situations. Of course, this also has additional ecosystem benefits, so it's a bit of a win-win in those circumstances. That, I think, is a really nice link between the work that Jim and others have looked at as well, and also the Reef credit scheme. So looking at, I think, going forward, looking at opportunities to combine those learnings into the schemes that are emerging or still in development. So the small scale monitoring work that Aaron talked about, of course, it's not just about the monitoring. It's about, I guess, facilitating practice change really, and one of the tools that's available for that. So at the beginning of the project, or prior to it, they've established a robust framework for the design implementation of sub-catchment programs, which has been used and implemented in Project 25. A bit of a caution or word of warning, I suppose, it takes a lot of capacity and resources to set up something like that, so shouldn't be taken on too lightly. The Project 25 itself has addressed that gap that we've had in science farm management communication, and through a collaborative model. So they've got the locally relevant data, they've been communicating and providing that feedback at the scale that people are interested in, and then as I guess on the other aspect of it, they've developed the local trust in the science to facilitate the practice change through a series of interactions and information supply and knowledge generation. Aaron highlighted that establishing those relationships and frameworks for that change has taken a lot of time. It's been resource intensive, and requires expertise, a whole range of disciplines. But I think the findings there provide a solid foundation for shifting that into other areas as well. Over, I guess, a number of the projects, including this one, they've highlighted that those finer scale assessments are very necessary when we're talking about optimal program design, and we tend to work at a catchment level in a strategic way, and I think now this is highlighting that need to move down to the sub-catchment scale and finer in our assessments. The alternatives mechanisms chunk of work, Jim went through the work that they've done on trading both at I guess a farm scale and end of catchment. So they've highlighted that a nitrogen trading market in cane catchments could deliver improved economic efficiency. So as the cap tightens, the market price for nitrogen increases and the conversion of marginally productive cane land in key locations to wetlands becomes economically viable. And there's that link there with the progress of Nathan's work as well. That sort of approach could reward growers who can most effectively reduce their nitrogen losses and then maximise production and it's most relevant in the better soils in particular. And it could also help incentivise innovation and implementation of existing pest management practices and new approaches as well. The trading at the end of catchment, they've done it both in nitrogen and sediment, has the potential also to be an important facilitator of cost-effective expansion. So remember, he was talking about beyond the period of reef plan and the targets currently, but their scenarios have shown that you could do that with no net decline in water quality. So, you know, you're carefully looking at not undoing all the good that's already being implemented by linking with other sources and offset programs. So Peter talked about the insurance program. So options that they've explored, insuring against the risk of loss by having reduced nitrogen application rates. They've demonstrated that it's technically feasible. As he said, though, there's a bit of work to be done yet in working out how that could be commercially viable for a company to be interested in setting that up. And then to also bring along the farmers with that and get that interest in the engagement there. But they've got further work to do that. And then finally, John highlighted that the data on cost effectiveness is really important for targeting and prioritisation. Should be automatically collected at the project level and then to inform what might become of funding programs, but also in designing them as well. And in that too, he highlighted there's a need for consistent metrics. So that's the highlights in a very quick overview. Just some examples of research informing management through the project. So there have been direct reductions in the DIN losses associated with the practices that have been trialled and implemented. That could lead to a potential reduction in ecosystem impacts associated with the improved understanding of the different applications for overcoming barriers to nitrogen reduction. We've learned a lot about water quality tools and protocols, and then the application of new ecosystem health indicators within monitoring program may become more relevant. There was also, I think, highlighted there's opportunities for managers to combine the outcomes from a few of these projects to look at integrated policy options and different instruments for reducing nitrogen losses. And of course, the results are already informing investment, but can continue to do that in the Reef Trust program and the examples like the major integrated project in the wet tropics. And then this work will all be used in our foundational policy documents, such as the consensus statement and next outlook report. And just on that, they all will be externally peer reviewed before they're finalised and published, and same with the synthesis reports. So just final slide. So what are we doing now? So the researchers, if they haven't already, are finalising their research reports, or a lot of them are out for review. Also contributing to the technical synthesis reports. We're still drafting the case studies. The interactive website is being developed. It won't be live until next year, but we're developing the content for that still. And we're looking at a forum in April where we can share the products of the synthesis efforts, as well as if people are interested, more detailed or comprehensive overviews of the research projects. So just to wrap up, thank you everybody. So to the researchers for putting those presentations together and condensing your stuff into a very short timeline. To the Hub Liaison Officers and RRC for coordinating this and setting it up, and to participants for joining us today. I will encourage you to follow up with researchers if you have further questions, and just to get a bit of feedback on the timing of their final outputs. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. And just to everyone else who's still with us, Julie Carmody has shared a link in the chat window to the webinars homepage on the Tropical Water Quality Hub webpage. We will be adding these webinars bit by bit as they are published to that homepage, and you're free to distribute that link to anyone in your industry or colleague networks.
Excellent. Thank you.